The crystalline hall stretched out before Daniel Price as he walked toward the center podium, where 500 different alien species waited and watched him with curious eyes, and some with things that were not eyes at all, but served the same purpose, and Daniel felt their attention pressing down on him like a physical weight, because humanity had only been part of this galactic council for 20 years, which was nothing compared to the millions of years these other civilizations had been talking and trading and living together in peace. Daniel was a tall man with brown hair going gray at the temples, and he wore the formal blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, with its silver stars on the collar, and he kept his face calm, even though his heart was beating fast, because what he was about to say would either save humanity or destroy any chance his species had of survival in this vast galaxy, full of beings who thought humans were nothing more than violent children, who had barely learned to walk among the stars. The council speaker was a creature named Velthar, who looked like liquid mercury shaped into something almost like a person, and when he spoke his voice came directly into Daniel's mind, without using sound at all, and Velthar said that the council was meeting because of a terrible crisis that threatened every living thing in the galaxy. And Daniel listened as the alien explained that something called the Devourer Swarm had come back after 3 million years of silence. The Devourer Swarm was a nightmare made real, and it came from beyond the galaxy, and it ate everything in its path and turned all living matter into more of itself. And the last time it had come to this galaxy, it had killed trillions of beings and destroyed 40% of all inhabited worlds before it finally stopped and went dormant. And now it was back, and it was even bigger than before. And 12 colony worlds had already gone silent, with every person and animal and plant consumed and converted into more swarm creatures. Velthar told the assembled species that the eternal peace accord, which had kept the galaxy safe for millions of years, demanded that they all retreat to fortified worlds and wait for the swarm to exhaust itself, just like their ancestors had done 3 million years ago, and evacuation ships were already being prepared, and populations were being moved to safer locations, and everyone would survive if they just followed the plan and stayed calm and did not panic. Daniel felt anger rising in his chest as he listened to this plan that was not really a plan at all, but just a decision to let billions of beings die, while the lucky ones hid behind walls and waited for the monster to get tired of eating. And he thought about Earth and about the 5 billion humans who trusted their leaders to protect them, and he thought about the human colonies on Mars and Europa and Titan, where children played and families lived and worked and dreamed of the future. He activated his communication device and requested permission to speak, and the gesture made many of the aliens whisper among themselves, because humans almost never spoke at these council sessions because everyone knew that humanity was too young and too primitive to have anything useful to say about important galactic matters. But Velthar gave permission anyway, and Daniel walked to the podium and looked out at 500 species who had forgotten what it meant to fight. Daniel began by saying that he had studied the historical records of the last Devourer Swarm incursion very carefully, and he had consulted with human military experts and scientists and historians, and he had learned that the Council's plan of retreat and preservation had resulted in the deaths of trillions of innocent beings, and this time the swarm was even larger and more dangerous, and the old plan would not work, because there might not be anyone left alive when the swarm finally stopped eating. Velthar responded in his calm mental voice that the Council understood the risks, but the Eternal Peace Accord was sacred and had kept the galaxy civilized for millions of years, and warfare was primitive and barbaric, and the advanced species of the Council had evolved beyond such violence, and they would not break their most important law, even in the face of extinction, because being civilized meant something. Daniel felt his anger turn into something colder and harder, and he looked at Velthar and at all the other species, and he said in a clear voice that carried through the chamber that perhaps it was time to remember what violence in defense of life really meant, and that humanity had a different proposal to offer. And he said the words that would change everything when he told them that, speaking with the full authority of Earth's government, it was time for war. The chamber exploded with noise as species that had been silent for centuries cried out in shock and disbelief, and others activated their translation devices, which blazed with outrage and confusion, and Velthar raised one liquid appendage to restore order, and when the noise finally died down, he asked Daniel if humanity understood the consequences of violating the peace accord, which would mean expulsion from the Galactic Council and complete isolation from all trade and knowledge. sharing and protection? Daniel nodded and said that yes, humanity understood, and yes, humanity was willing to accept those consequences, because humans would not stand by and watch genocide on an unimaginable scale when they had the means to fight back. And another counselor, who was a reptilian creature named Courtmash, spoke up and said that humanity was like children, playing at war because humans had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. And what could such a young species possibly offer against a force that had consumed entire galaxies? Daniel allowed himself a small smile, and he told Courtmash that humanity had spent its entire existence at war because humans had fought against nature, and against each other, and against every challenge the universe had thrown at them. And humans had not had the luxury of 3 million years of peace to forget how to survive and how to kill when killing was necessary. And humanity remembered what these ancient species had forgotten, and humans were very, very good at war. He activated a holographic display that showed tactical analyses prepared by Earth's military forces, and he explained that humanity was not asking the Council to fight alongside them, but only asking for access to the Outer Rim and for intelligence about the swarm. And if the Council gave humanity these small things, then humanity would show the galaxy what war really meant, and what it meant to fight for survival, instead of just hiding and hoping. The Council chamber fell silent as the various species tried to understand what this young human was offering. And Velthar said that this matter required serious deliberation, and the Council would reconvene in one standard cycle, and Daniel should remain available for questioning. And then the session ended and the aliens began to leave. Daniel stood alone at the podium thinking about what he had just done, because he had gambled everything on a single belief that sometimes the only way to achieve peace was to fight for it, and he hoped desperately that he was right, because if he was wrong, then humanity would face the Devourer swarm alone and 5 billion people would die because of his decision, and he felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a mountain made of lead and stone. The Martian shipyards hung in orbit like massive metal islands, floating in the black ocean of space, and each one was bigger than most cities on Earth, and Admiral Karen Phillips stood on the observation deck watching as the last of the warships completed their preparations for the coming battle. And she was a compact woman with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen 3 colonial wars, and now she commanded the largest military force humanity had ever assembled, with 400 warships ranging from small fast destroyers to massive dreadnoughts that bristled with weapons. The peaceful species of the Galactic Council had never imagined in all their millions of years. Captain Henry Brooks walked up beside her carrying a datapad with the final readiness reports, and he was younger than Karen by almost 20 years with dark hair and sharp eyes, and he had earned 3 medals in the Belt Wars, and everyone said he was brilliant at tactics and even better at keeping his crews alive, which was why Karen trusted him completely. And Henry told her that all ships were ready, and all crews knew what was at stake, and they were prepared to do whatever was necessary. Karen took the datapad but did not look at it because she was watching the ships instead, and she asked Henry to tell her honestly if he thought they could win this war against an enemy that had nearly destroyed the entire galaxy once before. And Henry thought about the question carefully before answering that he did not know if they could win, but he knew they could fight, and sometimes that was enough. A communication alert chimed, and Daniel Price appeared on the holographic display looking tired but determined, and he told them that the Galactic Council had reached a decision after hours of debate and argument, and Karen felt her stomach tighten, because everything depended on what the Council had decided, and Daniel explained that humanity had been granted limited access to the Outer Rim, where the swarm was advancing, and the Council would share all intelligence about swarm movements and composition, but no Council species would provide military support, and if humanity failed, then humanity would be completely on its own. Karen asked what would happen if humanity succeeded, and Daniel paused before saying that perhaps the galaxy would learn that warriors still had a place even in a civilized universe. And then he added T. Had he been studying the historical records more carefully, and the swarm was not just a mindless force of nature, but had intelligence behind it, with patterns and purpose. And the Council species had survived the last incursion by hiding, not fighting, so they had never learned how the swarm thinks or adapts. Henry leaned forward and asked if that meant they were going in blind against an enemy they knew nothing about, and Daniel said yes, that was exactly what it meant, but learning by doing was the human way, and it was the only way they had. And Karen, allowed herself a grim smile and told Daniel that he had bought them the opportunity, and now the human fleet would make it count, and all ships would depart for the outer rim within the hour. The transmission ended and Karen turned to address her command staff, where officers from every nation on Earth and from all the colonies stood ready and waiting, and she told them that they had all heard the ambassador, and they were about to face an enemy that had nearly destroyed the galaxy once before, and the council species with all their advanced technology and millions of years of evolution had chosen to hide, but humans did not hide from monsters because humans hunted monsters instead. She brought up a tactical display showing the outer rim sectors where the Devourer swarm had been detected, and she explained that their first objective was reconnaissance in force because they needed to understand how this enemy fought and moved, and what its weaknesses were, and they would not engage in a full fleet action until they had that intelligence, and Captain Brooks would lead the initial contact mission with a strike group of 30 ships that were fast and mobile and expendable, if necessary. Henry nodded without showing any reaction to the word expendable, because he understood the risks better than anyone. And Karen continued explaining that the rest of the fleet would establish a defensive perimeter, 3 systems away from the last. Reported swarm contact, and they would fortify their position and prepare and learn from whatever Brooks brought back, and she asked if there were any questions. A young tactical officer named Greg Morris raised his hand and asked what would happen if the council was right and humanity could not win, and Karen met his eyes steadily and told him that if they could not win, then they would buy time for the rest of the galaxy to evacuate, and they would bleed this swarm for every meter of space it took from them, and when future historians wrote about this moment, they would say that humanity stood when others fell and showed the galaxy what courage truly meant. No one else had questions, and Karen dismissed them to their stations because they had a war to fight. And as the command staff dispersed, Henry remained behind and asked permission to speak freely, and Karen told him he could always speak freely. With her and Henry said that they were about to lead 400 ships and 200,000 personnel into battle against an enemy that had consumed galaxies, and the odds were not in their favor. Karen looked out at the fleet one more time, where each ship represented billions of dollars and years of research, and most importantly the lives of trained soldiers who had volunteered for this mission, knowing they might never come home. And she told Henry that the odds were never in humanity's favor, because humans were a young species in an old galaxy, and they were weak compared to most council races, and they had no ancient weapons, or millions of years of scientific advancement, and all they had was their will to survive and their refusal to surrender, and that would have to be enough. Henry saluted, and said that they would show the galaxy what it meant to fight like a human, and 2 hours later the first wave of the human fleet departed from Mars orbit, and the ships jumped to faster than light speeds, leaving behind a solar system that held its collective breath. And on Earth 5 billion people watched the news feeds knowing that their fate now rested with 400 ships heading into the unknown. In the Galactic Council chambers, the various species monitored the human departure with curiosity and concern, and in some cases pity, because they did not believe the humans could succeed against the Devourer swarm, because how could they, when the swarm was extinction incarnate? But they would watch nonetheless, even if only to witness the final act of a young species too foolish to know when to surrender, and too brave to know when to run away. Captain Henry Brooks sat in the command chair of the destroyer Liberty, watching the sensor displays with the intensity of a predator hunting dangerous prey, and 29 other ships surrounded his vessel in a loose formation with every crew member on high alert as they approached the coordinates where the Devourer swarm had last been detected. And the outer rim was beautiful in its emptiness, with stars scattered across the void like diamonds thrown on black velvet and nebulae painting. Cosmic clouds in shades of purple and gold, and it seemed impossible that something so evil could exist in such beauty. Lieutenant Amy Cole, who was his tactical officer, called out that contact would happen in 3 minutes, and she was a sharp woman from the lunar colonies with an almost supernatural gift for reading sensor data. And Henry opened a channel to all 30 ships and told them to remember that they were here to observe and learn, and they should not engage unless fired upon. But when the shooting started, and it would definitely start, their priority was gathering intelligence, because every piece of data they collected could save millions of lives later. The responses came back quickly, with all captains acknowledging their orders, And these were good crews with veterans who understood that sometimes the mission mattered more than individual survival. And Amy announced that contact would happen in 90 seconds, and sensors were picking up massive distortions in gravity ahead. And whatever these things were, they were big. And the main view screen shifted to show what the long-range cameras were seeing. And what appeared made Henry feel ice water replaced the blood in his veins. The swarm was not a fleet of ships in any normal sense, but instead was a living wall of horror that mixed biology with machinery, and thousands of organisms, each one the size of a skyscraper, moved through space like a school of predatory fish, hunting for food. And they were vaguely insect-like, with armored shells that seemed to shift between organic chitin and metallic alloys, and tendrils extended from their bodies, tasting the void and seeking prey. The helmsman, who was Lieutenant Paul Chen and normally never showed fear, whispered "My God" under his breath, and Henry told everyone to stay steady and ordered Amy to run a full sensor sweep because he wanted everything, including energy signatures and propulsion methods and communication frequencies and structural composition. And Amy activated the Liberty's sensors, which bathed the swarm in electromagnetic radiation, and the response was immediate and terrifying. The swarm changed direction as one entity turning toward the human fleet, like a single massive organism becoming aware of food nearby. And Amy reported that they had been detected, and thousands of projectiles were incoming, and the view screen filled with streaking lights as the swarm launched biological missiles that were living weapons, accelerating to impossible speeds. Henry ordered all ships to take evasive action and to return fire at will because they needed to see how the swarm would react to human weapons, and the Liberty's railguns opened up, sending magnetically accelerated projectiles at a fraction of light speed, and the kinetic energy alone was enough to vaporize most known materials. And the round struck the leading swarm organisms and punched clean through their armored hides, leaving gaping holes. But the creatures did not die, and instead they began to regenerate, with new tissue growing to fill the wounds even as they continued their advance. And Amy reported that conventional weapons were less effective than hoped because the swarm was adapting their armor in real time. And Henry watched as other ships in his formation engaged with the destroyer Freedom, launching nuclear-tipped missiles that created miniature suns in the void. The nuclear explosions consumed dozens of swarm organisms, but hundreds more surged through the flames, seemingly unaffected by radiation that would have killed any normal carbon-based life. And Henry ordered his ships to switch to plasma weapons because they needed to try something the swarm had not adapted to yet. And the Liberty's plasma cannons fired, sending superheated bolts of ionized matter into the swarm. This time the effect was devastating as the plasma burned through the biomechanical armor like a torch through wax, and the creatures writhed in what might have been pain. And Amy said with grim satisfaction that it was working. But then she warned Henry to watch because the swarm was learning, and Henry saw what she meant as his ships fired plasma weapon after plasma weapon, and the swarm organisms began to adapt with their armor, shifting composition, and becoming reflective to dissipate the heat. What had been devastatingly effective just minutes ago was becoming less effective with each shot. And Henry muttered that the swarm was learning from every attack, and this was what the Council had been afraid of, because here was an enemy that adapted faster than you could kill it. And one of his ships, which was the cruiser Independence, took a direct hit from a cluster of biological missiles. The weapons burrowed into the hull like parasites, and Henry watched in horror as they began to consume the ship from within, converting its mass into more swarm material. And Amy reported that Independence was lost, and crew, Eva, Quation had failed because the swarm was too fast, and Henry felt the weight of those deaths, but he could not afford to mourn yet. He asked Amy if they were getting the data they needed, and she confirmed that yes, every moment of this engagement was being recorded and analyzed, but she recommended they withdraw because they had learned what they came to learn, and they were losing ships. And she was right, because 3 more vessels were taking heavy damage with their hulls breached and their crews fighting desperate battles. Henry commanded all ships to execute a phased withdrawal, with groups of 5 falling back in sequence and covering each other as they retreated toward the jump point. And the withdrawal was orderly but costly, with 2 more ships lost before the human formation managed to break contact and jump to faster than light speeds. And the swarm did not pursue, but instead returned to its original course, which was deeper into Council space. Hours later, back at the staging area where Admiral Karen Phillips waited with the main fleet, Henry delivered his report to the assembled command staff, And he told them that the swarm was more dangerous than anyone had imagined, because it adapted to every weapon they used and learned from every engagement in conventional warfare, as humanity knew it would not work, because they needed a new strategy. Karen studied the recorded footage with an unreadable expression, and then she said that the swarm could be hurt, and Henry had proved that much, and they were not invincible. And Henry agreed, but said they might as well be invincible if humanity could not develop new weapons faster than the swarm could adapt. And he told Karen that they had lost 6 ships and 1,200 personnel in that engagement, and they had barely scratched the enemy. A younger officer named Commander Lisa Grant spoke up and asked what would happen if they stopped trying to fight the swarm conventionally. And Karen turned to her and told her to explain her idea, and Lisa said that the swarm adapted to patterns and repeated tactics, so what if humanity made sure they never used the same tactic twice? Lisa continued by saying that human warfare had always been about innovation and unpredictability, because while council species spent millions of years in peace, humans spent their entire history finding new ways to kill each other, and every weapon humans had was designed to counter the last innovation. And humanity was uniquely qualified to fight an adaptive enemy, because humans were adaptive themselves. Karen smiled slowly and said that Lisa was suggesting they turn this into a technology race, where every engagement used different weapons and different tactics to keep the swarm constantly adapting and never giving them time to develop a complete defense. And Lisa said exactly and added that there was something else, because the swarm learned from humans, but humans also learned from the swarm. Lisa explained that her sensor data showed the organisms communicated through quantum entanglement, and if they could disrupt that communication, they might be able to break the swarm's coordination. And Henry looked at the young commander with new respect and said that could work, but they would need time to develop the necessary weapons, and they did not have time. Karen stood up with her decision made, and she told Henry to take another strike force and harass the swarm and slow their advance and gather more data, and she told Lisa that she had 72 hours to develop a quantum disruption weapon, and the rest of the fleet would continue preparing defenses. And she looked at each of them and said, the council thought humans were fools for fighting, but humanity would show them that sometimes foolishness was just another word for courage. 3 weeks into the campaign, humanity was learning the brutal lessons of total war, and Admiral Karen Phillips stood in the war room of the command station surrounded by holographic displays, showing the tactical situation across 12 star systems, with red markers indicating swarm presence and blue markers showing human positions, and too many gray markers representing worlds that had fallen silent with their populations consumed. Commander Lisa Grant stepped forward with dark circles under her eyes, betraying the sleepless nights she had spent developing new weapons, and she reported that the quantum disruption mines were deployed in the Theta sector, and if the swarm entered that region, their coordination would be severely compromised, and additionally they had successfully tested prototype nanite weapons that attacked the swarm at a molecular level. Karen asked quietly about casualties, and Lisa's voice remained professional, but the strain was audible as she said that 19 more ships had been lost this week, and they were down to 317 operational vessels with personnel. Losses approaching 5,000, and a communication alert interrupted them as Captain Henry Brooks appeared on the main display, looking haggard but determined. Henry told them they had a situation because the swarm had split into 3 separate groups, and they were moving faster than before and adapting their strategy because they were no longer advancing in a single wave, but trying to surround the human defensive positions. And Karen felt ice in her veins because this was what she had feared most. She asked for recommendations, and Henry replied that they needed to force the swarm back together, because if the swarm surrounded them, they would be fighting on multiple fronts. But he had an idea that was risky, but might work, and Karen told him she was listening, and Henry explained that they would use themselves as bait. He said that one large portion of the fleet would make a direct assault on the central swarm group, forcing them to commit their forces, and meanwhile smaller strike forces would hit the flanking groups, drawing them back to defend the center, and if they could compress the swarm back into a single formation, they could hit them with everything they had, and Karen considered the plan carefully. It was indeed risky because it required splitting their forces, which was exactly what they were trying to prevent the swarm from doing to them. But Henry was right that they could not afford to fight a multi-front war, and Karen made her decision and told Henry to do it. But she said that bait fleet needed to be strong enough to survive until the strike forces completed their missions, and she was giving him command of the assault and told him to take whatever ships he needed. Henry understood and said they would launch in 6 hours, and the preparation was frantic but efficient, because humanity had become very good at organizing for war in the past 3 weeks, with supply ships loading ammunition and fuel while medical, frigates prepared to receive casualties and the combat vessels formed into their assigned groups, ready to execute what might be humanity's most desperate gambit yet. On the bridge of the dreadnought Washington, which was now serving as Henry's flagship, the captain addressed his crew and told them that in about 2 hours, they were going to fly directly at the largest concentration of swarm organisms ever recorded, and the swarm would try to kill them and would probably succeed in killing some of them. But while the swarm was focused on them, their brothers and sisters would strike from the flanks. He said that together they would teach these creatures that humanity did not surrender not to extinction and not to fear. And the crew, which was 2,000 men and women from across Earth and the colonies, responded with a roar of defiance, and the Washington led a force of 100 ships into the Theta sector, where Lisa's quantum disruption mines waited. The swarm was already there, having detected the human presence through methods still not fully understood, and Henry commanded all ships to open fire with everything they had to make the swarm notice them, and the human fleet opened fire with a symphony of destruction that included railguns sending tungsten rods at relativistic speeds, and plasma cannons superheating the void, and nuclear missiles blooming like deadly flowers. The experimental nanite weapons, which were clouds of microscopic machines designed to disassemble matter at the molecular level, drifted toward the swarm like invisible death, and the swarm responded with fury as biological missiles by the thousands swarmed toward the human ships, but this time the humans were ready with point defense systems improved after weeks of combat experience, creating a screen of laser fire that destroyed incoming projectiles by the hundreds. The Washington crossed into the minefield, and the quantum disruption mines activated, sending pulses of entangled particles specifically designed to interfere with the swarm's communication network, and the effect was immediate and dramatic as the swarm organisms, which had been moving in perfect coordination, suddenly faltered and collided with each other, with their formations breaking apart in confusion. Amy Cole shouted from her tactical station that it was working, and the swarm was disorganized and their adaptation was slowing, and Henry allowed himself a moment of satisfaction before opening fleet-wide communications and ordering the strike forces to execute now. And on the flanks of the swarm's separated groups, 2 smaller human forces of 50 ships each struck with surgical precision. They targeted the largest organisms first because those seemed to coordinate the others and hit them with concentrated plasma fire before they could adapt, and the swarm tried to respond. But their communication network was still disrupted, and individual organisms fought back fiercely but without coordination. They were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Amy announced that Admiral Phillips was reporting success on the northern flank, and the SWAR M group there was collapsing and retreating toward the central mass, and another officer added that the southern flank was reporting similar results. And Henry watched the tactical display as the swarm's 3 groups began to merge back together, exactly as he had hoped. But they were doing so in the middle of the quantum disruption field, and they were disorganized and vulnerable, and Henry commanded all ships to form on the Washington and told them they were going to push the swarm back to wherever they came from, and ordered a full attack. What followed was the largest space battle in human history, with 300 ships against thousands of swarm organisms fighting in a volume of space larger than most solar systems, and the void lit up with weapons fire and explosions, and the death throes of both human vessels and swarm creatures. The Washington took hit after hit with its armor scorched and breached in a dozen places, but it kept fighting, and beside it the carrier Roosevelt launched wave after wave of fighter craft, which were small, agile ships crewed by pilots whose daring bordered on suicidal as they darted between swarm organisms, placing explosive charges with precision. Slowly and impossibly the swarm began to retreat, because the combination of quantum disruption and rapidly changing human tactics and sheer ferocity was proving effective, and the swarm was learning that humans were not like the other species it had encountered, because humans were not prey waiting to be consumed, but were predators too. Amy reported with disbelief in her voice that the swarm was breaking off and actually retreating, and Henry allowed himself to slump in his command chair with exhaustion overwhelming him, and he asked about casualties, and Amy paused before saying, that 42 ships were lost or severely damaged with estimated 12,000 personnel casualties. But they had won, and for the first time they had actually pushed the swarm back. Henry nodded slowly but felt no joy in the victory because 12,000 people were dead, and 42 ships were destroyed, and the price of war was always measured in blood, and he asked to speak with Admiral Phillips, and when Karen's face appeared on the screen she looked as exhausted as he felt. Karen told Henry that he had done it and actually done it, but Henry said that they had done it together and this was just the beginning, because the swarm would adapt again and learn from this defeat, and they needed to keep innovating and keep changing their tactics, and Karen agreed but said that for now they had bought the council time. She added that they had proven something important, which was that the swarm could be beaten, and she told Henry to return to base because he and his people had earned rest. And as the surviving ships began the journey back to the staging area, Henry looked at the sensor display showing the retreating swarm. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over, and yet for the first time since this had all begun, Henry felt something he had not expected to feel, which was hope. Because if they could beat the swarm once, they could beat it again. And if they kept fighting and kept learning and kept adapting, then maybe, just maybe, humanity could save not just themselves, but the entire galaxy from extinction. The crew around him began to cheer as the reality of their victory sank in, and Henry allowed himself a small smile, because these people had faced impossible odds and survived, and they had shown the galaxy what humans were capable of when they fought for something bigger than themselves. 2 months after the Battle of Theta Sector, Ambassador Daniel Price once again stood before the Galactic Council. But this time the atmosphere in the crystalline chamber was completely different, because the condescension was gone and replaced by something else that looked like respect mixed with fear. And Council Speaker Velthar addressed the assembly with his liquid mercury form rippling in what might have been agitation. Velthar told the gathered species that the human fleet had achieved what everyone believed was impossible, because the Devourer swarm had been pushed back 15 sectors, and their advance had stalled for the first time in recorded history, and the question now before the council was what they should do with this knowledge. And Daniel waited, knowing this moment was critical, because Admiral Karen Phillips had given him a simple message to deliver, which was to tell them that humanity was willing to teach if they were willing to learn. Councillor Courtmash, who was the reptilian who had once dismissed humanity as children playing at war, spoke up and asked Daniel how many ships humanity had lost in this campaign. And Daniel replied honestly that 143 vessels had been destroyed and approximately 28,000 personnel had been killed in action, with another 15,000 wounded. And a murmur went through the chamber, because those numbers represented nearly a third of the human fleet and a staggering percentage of casualties by council standards. Another counselor asked why humanity continued to fight when they could evacuate to their inner worlds and wait for the swarm to exhaust itself like the council planned to do. And Daniel shook his head and said that humanity had learned something in their short, violent history, which was that evil triumphs when good people do nothing, and humans fought because someone had to fight, and they fought because every world the swarm consumed held billions of lives, and each one was precious and irreplaceable. He activated a holographic display showing footage from the Battle of Theta Sector, and the council watched in silence as human ships threw themselves against overwhelming odds, and Daniel said that yes, the council was correct to call humans violent and primitive, but humanity had also spent its existence learning that some things were worth fighting for, including freedom and life and the future, and these were not just human values, but universal values. Velthar's form stilled completely and asked what Daniel was proposing, and Daniel explained that the swarm had adapted to human tactics once already and would adapt again, and humanity estimated they had perhaps 6 more months before the swarm overcame their current technological advantages, but in those 6 months they could do something revolutionary by teaching the council species how to fight. The chamber erupted in debate, with some counselors arguing that such a course violated the very foundation of the Eternal Peace Accord, while others countered that there could be no peace if everyone was dead, and a new voice cut through the noise, belonging to a species humanity had never encountered, which was one of the eldest races in the council, existing as patterns of energy within magnetic fields. This ancient being said that human courage honored the memory of warriors past. But warfare was not simply a matter of weapons and tactics, because it required something that most council species had lost millions of years ago, which was the will to inflict harm even in defense of righteousness. And the being asked how Daniel proposed to teach that quality. Daniel considered the question carefully and said that humanity did not need to teach them to be warriors, but only to teach them to defend themselves. And there was a difference because one was about aggression and the other was about survival. And over the next hour, Daniel outlined a plan that would have seemed impossible 2 months earlier. He explained that human military advisors would be assigned to willing council species, and they would share tactical knowledge and weapon designs, and most importantly, the mindset required for effective defense, and in return, council species would share their advanced technologies, allowing humanity to develop even more effective weapons, and it would be a partnership born of necessity, but it would also be proof that even in the darkest times, cooperation was possible. When the vote was called, it was not unanimous because several species voted to continue the policy of retreat and isolation. But for the first time in millions of years, the majority of the Galactic Council voted to prepare for war, and 6 months later the second great battle against the Devourer swarm took place in the Centris system, which was home to one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. But this time the humans did not fight alone. Admiral Karen Phillips stood on the bridge of the Washington, which had been fully repaired and upgraded with Council technology, and beside her vessel floated ships from 20 different species, each one now armed with human-designed weapons and crewed by beings who had learned the basics of combat, and Captain Henry Brooks, who was now promoted to Commodore, commanded a mixed battle group of human and alien vessels. Henry's tactical officer, Lieutenant Amy Cole, worked alongside a crystalline being named Shardy. And their different perspectives combined to create innovative strategies, and the swarm came as expected, larger than before and more adapted and more dangerous. But the defensive fleet was also stronger and smarter and more unified. Karen broadcast on all frequencies with her words translated into hundreds of languages, and she told them that today they fought not as separate species, but as one galaxy united against extinction, and they would show the swarm what happened when civilized beings remembered how to bare their teeth, and she ordered all weapons to fire at will. The battle was fierce and terrible, with ships from species that had not known war in millions of years fighting and dying beside human vessels. But they fought with purpose and coordination, and most importantly with hope and the quantum disruption. Fields now enhanced with Council technology created zones where the swarm's coordination completely broke down. New weapons combining human innovation with alien science proved devastatingly effective, and for the first time the swarm faced an enemy that outnumbered it, and when the swarm finally broke and retreated, fleeing back toward the galactic rim, a cheer went up across the fleet that transcended species barriers, and it was the sound of a galaxy that had rediscovered its will to survive. In the aftermath, as damaged ships limped back to friendly ports and the wounded were tended, Daniel Price met with Velthar one final time, and the council speaker said that humanity had changed the galaxy because they had forgotten that survival sometimes required sacrifice, and humans had reminded them. And Daniel smiled tiredly and said that they had reminded each other because humanity had learned something too, which was that courage meant nothing without purpose, and the willingness to fight had to be tempered by wisdom. Velthar asked what would happen now, and Daniel replied that now they would hunt because the swarm was retreating, but it still existed, and they would pursue it to the edge of the galaxy if necessary, and ensure it never threatened their worlds again, and they would do it together. And Velthar's form rippled with approval and said the Eternal Peace Accord must be amended because there was peace and then there was surrender, and they had confused the two. Daniel agreed that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice, and sometimes justice required warriors to defend it. And months became years as the war against the Devourer swarm continued. But now it was a war the galaxy was winning, with human and alien crews working side by side and sharing knowledge and combining strengths and covering weaknesses. New technologies emerged from this cooperation, with advances that might have taken millions of years in peacetime achieved in mere decades. Under the pressure of war, and always at the forefront of the fight, were human ships and crews, not because they were the strongest or most advanced, but because they had been the first to stand, and the first to say no more, and the first to remember that some things were worth fighting for. 5 years after Daniel Price had shocked the Galactic Council with his declaration of war, the last major swarm concentration was destroyed in a coordinated strike involving 300 species, and the devourer swarm still existed in isolated pockets small enough to be hunted down by patrol groups, but as a galactic threat it was finished. In the celebration that followed, as species that had barely acknowledged each other for millions of years now gathered in friendship, Admiral Karen Phillips stood with Commodore Henry Brooks and Commander Lisa Grant watching the festivities, and Karen said quietly that they had lost 70,000 people, which was nearly half of everyone who started this fight, and Henry replied that they had saved trillions across hundreds of species, and that was a legacy worth having. Lisa looked up at the stars visible through the station's viewing ports and asked if they had changed the galaxy, or if the galaxy had changed them, and Karen smiled and said both, because humans had reminded the galaxy how to fight, and the galaxy had taught humans what they were fighting for. And together they were something neither could have been alone. Far below on Earth, the planet that had given birth to humanity, people looked up at those same stars and knew that their place in the galaxy was secure, because they were no longer the newcomers, or the primitives, or the children playing at civilization. But they were the humans who had stood when others fell and fought when others surrendered, and reminded an ancient galaxy what courage truly meant. Across that galaxy, on worlds of 1,000 different types, beings of 1,000 different species, told stories of the human ambassador who had stunned the Galactic Council with 4 simple words that changed everything by saying, "It is time for war," but those stories always ended with a different message that Daniel Price himself had spoken in the aftermath of victory. He had said that humanity fought not because they loved war, but because they loved peace enough to defend it, and the galaxy should never forget the difference. And the galaxy never did forget, because carved into monuments on 100 worlds were the names of the humans who had died teaching the ancient species how to survive, and humanity's place among the stars was no longer that of children, but of teachers and warriors and friends who had proven that sometimes the youngest voice in the room speaks the truest words.